All right, the beginnings of agriculture in Africa and the world. So, we know when we talked about yesterday that farming basically begins about 10,000 years ago. So all farming begins about 10,000 years ago when basically our hunters and gatherers who were nomadic. It's a word I don't think I used yesterday. What does the word nomadic mean? Go ahead.
Moving from place to place.
Yes, moving from place to place. So if you're nomadic, you're moving from place to place. Hunters and gatherers were nomadic. They were always moving around. And they'd travel in groups of 10 to 100 like we talked about. And because of that, they would have to do things like their young women would have to leave and go marry someone in another clan or group and leave them. Anyway, so what happens 10,000 years ago, life starts to change. 10,000 years ago, people start to stop being hunters and gatherers. People start to stop being hunters and gatherers. And they do this because, again, someone gets the genius idea of let's take these animals and instead of killing them and eating them right away, let's keep them. See if we can domesticate and tame them. Get them to reproduce, and then basically eat some of them. And then keep reproducing them and eat some of them. And then our food is right there. This is basically the beginning of all agriculture or the beginning of all farming. So what happens is when you're a hunter-gatherer, you basically have to have a house that you can carry. You got to carry it around with you. Or you got to keep building new shelters. When you domesticate animals, you can now build a house and you keep it in one place. And your food is right nearby. You grow crops, which again we talked about yesterday. Someone had the genius idea. Maybe it was an accident. I think it was part accident that they saw how plants were growing. And they learned how to plant the seeds. They learned how to grow it. They learned how to eat it. And now they're in one spot. They're no longer nomadic. Now they're in one spot, and this basically is the beginning of farming and agriculture. Now in Africa, we look at northern Africa here, and we know that northern Africa now is the Sahara Desert. But it wasn't always the Sahara Desert. If you go back in time 15,000 years, it is a forest. Now how would we know that? How would we know that 15,000 years ago, Africa was a forest? What evidence would there be? Feel free to raise your hands, I just won't say your names. One person knows? Got a couple here? What do you think in the back? Okay, potentially because there's still hunting and gathering going on there. There's a little bit, but not too much. Some people live in here, but not very many. What else would let us know that this was a forest? What were you thinking?
That they found bark.
Ah, you find old evidence of old trees. Also, you find evidence of animals that lived in the forest. And what are they doing in the Sahara Desert? Did someone move them there? Yeah, it's not likely, especially if they're deep in the ground. That's evidence that it used to be a forest. So this region used to be a forest. That meant hunters and gatherers could live there and stay there. But over a long process of thousands of years, the climate changes. Climate change is not new. Climate change has been going on for forever. But climate change normally is a slow, long process. So over thousands of years, what happens is the desert dries up, and the hunters and gatherers, they start moving. As it becomes more desert, they move away from there. Where does this push them if I look on here on the map? Where does it push them to? If I look on here. Where are they going to go? It's getting dry, it's getting hot, the desert's there. Where do you go? What do you need to live? Water. What did we talk about in our first chapters this year? Yeah. Egypt becomes a place to go because the Nile River is right here. You get pushed this way, the desert, the trees go away, you get to the Nile River, that's a pretty good place to stay. Other people go up towards the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia or Samaria. And what happens is when you're near the river, you got motivation to stay there. And that's where we get our first civilization started. So 6,000 BC, that'd be 8,000 years ago, that's when it completely becomes desert at that point. And that's almost the same time that farming starts in this region. Now I'm making a bit of an inference here. Do I know this for a fact that that's the reason? No, but sometimes history is like a puzzle. You got to kind of put the pieces together. So seeing how the desert dried up, and it was drying up at the same time, and people to survive, they learned how to farm. Probably not so much because they wanted to and they thought it'd be better. Probably because they had to survive. So again, they go to these regions, and another area we go to, which we're going to start focusing now in our chapter, is West Africa is another place where they go. They go down here from the Sahara into the Savannah region, right here, and they go into West Africa. Savannah just means tall grasslands. So Savannah just means tall grasslands. And this is where they start forming complex civilizations. This is where they start forming complex civilizations, small villages, cities. All right, we're going to move forward. All right, so society. Society brings government and religion. So what happens is, as the people slow down and they live, well, other people move in next to them. You have houses, you have farms. You want to be protected, so maybe you build a wall around, like we talked about Mesopotamia and Egypt, and you have a village. And these are basically like the first governments that form. We talked about them again with Mesopotamia and Egypt. Now we're going to talk about these villages in West Africa. So now we're looking at West Africa and how these villages are forming in West Africa. So traditional village structure in West Africa was based on village chiefs and council of elders. So you have the village chief, and you have some elders. Now these elders were pretty much like the heads of families. So if you had like your town here, your town would consist of these clans. It's called like a lineage based. What that basically means is it's like one big family. They all trace themselves back to one ancestor. Maybe this ancestor's last name will be Martinez. We'll just call him. So, what we see is that you have one elder. Just think of it like a family name, like the Martinez family. And who's ever the head here is in one of the council of elders. And then maybe you have the Johnson family. Maybe you have the Sanchez family. And then maybe you have the Wood family. Feel sorry for the village who gets the Wood family. Anyway, what happens is you pick a chief, and the chief comes from one of these families. So it's kind of like you got like 4 or 5 big families. That would be in a village. And then the elders of these get together, and they basically make up the rules and laws in the village and town. This would be where our government structure would be in West Africa. And it worked for a long time. It worked for hundreds, thousands of years. So again, like this one family, you got like the family tree, and they trace themselves back after generation, and whoever the elder in that family is pretty much in charge. If it was the Wood family, it would be like my dad. I think he's the oldest male now in the family. My grandma passed away a few years ago. So it'd be like he'd be the elder of the Wood family if we were like one big like lineage group. Go ahead. Most likely men. Good question. Most likely men. Could it have been women sometimes? I believe so. I think some villages had like elders where women could be there too. There are some examples of that, but the majority of examples we have are men. So good question. All right, so looking at that as well, we would also have local religions. Most people in these religions believed in something called animism. Animism, what that is it is the belief, most people are animistic, especially in West Africa. The West Africans, most of them believed in a God, in a one powerful God, kind of like a God on top. But then they also believed in spirits. And this is where it gets a little bit blurry, whether it's polytheistic or monotheistic. Because they believed kind of like in one big creator, but they believed in these spirits. Now, were these spirits gods? Were they more like angels? I don't really know. Go ahead.
Can you repeat what the religion's called?
Animism is right. Animism. So it's basically the belief that everything has a spirit. If it's living, it has a spirit. That means as simple as the grass, as simple as the animals. Everything has a spirit that you could pray to, even things like the rain. I don't know if donuts do. No way, that's up there. So anyway, so everything has a spirit, and it also has a belief in ancestor worship. That your family, you still worship to ancestors who have passed on. You can pray to your ancestors for advice, for help. You ask for their help in the present. So there was a belief in ancestor worship. Yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't that relate to the movie Avatar?
Yes, I believe it would. I would also relate it to a couple places we've studied about. Where else was there ancestor worship? You can say it out loud. China. There was ancestor worship in China that we saw. And there actually a great scene is in Mulan where there's ancestor worship. Also many American Indian religions, traditional religions, have the belief in ancestor worship as well. It's actually funny, if you go back and you look at ancient religions before like the main religions of like Christianity and Islam come in, a lot of them believe in this animism and like believing and worshiping our ancestors. It's pretty common. So let's take a look here. Now, some kingdoms do form. Some kingdoms do form. There's the Note culture. The Note culture forms a kingdom in West Africa. An early one before the year 1000. They actually, about the year 500, they have iron making, so they're making iron. Can you see why they're able to defeat their neighbors? Got stronger weapons. We also see Ascom, which is in modern-day Ethiopia and Somalia. That becomes a kingdom as well. There's Great Zimbabwe, which becomes a large kingdom. So there are several large kingdoms in Africa. For our chapter, we're going to focus on 3 Western African ones, the Soninke or Ghana, the Mali, and the Songhai Empire. All right, let me pause it now. All right.